welcome everybody to the very first episode of ABL Down on the Farm, a podcast, dedicated to all things prospects, but most particularly to prospects in the ABL, a 30-team dynasty league with 20 spots on each team for minor leaguers for a grand total of 600 gorgeous prospects to evaluate and talk about and debate. Tonight we've got two very special guests, Duke from the Pittsburgh Pirates and Jeff from the St. Louis Cardinals. And they're going to be joining me tonight. I'm the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, as most of you know. And we're going to be talking about various topics that are hopefully interesting to you. So without further ado, because we have a lot to cover, I'm going to bring in Jeff. And I'm going to bring in Duke. There you guys are. I think we got it right this time. Guys, I'm very happy to have you guys on the show, and thank you so much for joining. I couldn't think of two better people to be on the first one because we talked about prospects a lot over the years. And we're very fortunate tonight to have Duke on because he is the godfather of the ABL, the back-to-back defending champion, and the only champion so far in the ABL, and hopefully somebody can knock off the perk eventually. But I'm sure Duke wants to defend the title again. And poor Jeff keeps looking up the ladder at Duke, relegated to the fact that he can only finish at best third, I guess, for the moment. But maybe he can change that this year. But Duke, before we dove into the various topics we're going to be talking about tonight, I thought it would be fun to just give a little background for the uninitiated or the new to the ABL or the Armchair Fantasy Network generally about how you started this and got involved and what Jeff roles may have been in the process.
Yeah, so this started up, I guess, a little over 2 years ago. Almost 2.5 years ago. I think it was like December. Was that right? No, it was like the year before COVID, I think, right?
It was, yeah.
Yeah. So, Jeff was actually the first person that I kind of hooked up with when I was trying to start a 30-teamer. So my initial interest, I had joined some Facebook groups. I was in a dynasty league with Sam. I've only been playing dynasty for 4 or 5 years. Sam kind of actually got me into it. He just invited. It was just a free league with some of his buddies. They needed an extra person, and we had played just like redraft in the past. So Sam invited me to his league, and I really got into the prospect side of things and the dynasty aspect of fantasy baseball. So that was like my first taste and kind of what got me interested. And I realized pretty quickly that I think it was just a 12-team dynasty league that was free, and it kind of wet my whistle, but I wasn't getting everything I wanted out of it. So I was like, well, let's just go all in and do a 30-teamer. So my first idea was to do like the actual franchise draft. I got sucked into like a Facebook group where he wanted to do that. And I realized pretty quickly that that's kind of a lame format. I know some people love that, but it's not my thing, to just get stuck with a bunch of players that you have, no involvement in actually drafting.
Right.
But yeah, so that was kind of the first, the first idea for ABL was based on that league I played with Sam, and then started recruiting on Roto World. I think, like I said, Jeff was the first person I found, and he helped me a lot with kind of developing the constitution for ABL and all my other leagues, and then eventually moving over to Discord, which was huge, because that's the setup on Discord is great for what we have going and with all the leagues. So yeah, that's really it. Just kind of fell in love with Dynasty a couple years ago and jumped in head first.
Well, you guys have certainly helped create a very dynamic league. So kudos to you. I mean, this is a league that has hundreds and hundreds of trades, it seems like almost on a daily basis, but certainly every month there are hundreds of trades at a time. And Jeff, you actually recruited me into it. And I know you guys have recruited folks from other leagues over the years. I think we have a good group of guys, and it's a challenging endeavor to keep up with everything that's going on in the ABL. And we actually have multiple podcasts now in the league, which is great. I know we have another podcast on prospects coming up. I look forward to hearing about that. I don't know, Jeff, did you want to add anything about your experience getting involved in ABL?
Yeah, Duke captured it well. We were playing together in a smaller Roto league, which is Fluke, which is still still part of the network. It's kind of changed a little bit over the years, but I don't remember how I kind of found my way into that league, but that's where I first met Duke. And then as the season was wrapping down, I think Duke and I found ourselves talking a lot about baseball even after the season, and we ended up doing a bunch of best balls, and that's where we found TDBC and other things. And the fact that we were still talking about baseball in November and December kind of as soon as Duke kind of floated the idea of this 30 teamer, I was on board, and we started to try to find some other nuts that were interested in kind of year-round baseball and a dynasty league that would be real over the top. And yeah, I mean, this is his brainchild. He wrote the best constitution I've ever seen for a fantasy league, and the leagues continue to evolve and change and grow. I think a lot of us have, as openings have come up in ABL over the years, like people have reached out to their other people that are really good players in other leagues and being like, you would love this league. It's got so much trading. It's got so much conversation. If you're going to play dynasty baseball, this is the league for you. And that's why I brought you in, Steve, because you were awesome in the other leagues.
You're too kind. You're too kind. It's a lot of fun, and there's a lot of interesting characters in the league too. I think, which makes it even more entertaining. So and a lot of dedicated players, and everybody has different styles. And so I think that's one of the interesting things. And I know that each one of us has kind of a different approach when it comes to prospecting and dealing with prospects. And so I'm looking forward to that discussion, because I think we all have a lot of respect for each other in terms of the talent that we accumulated, but we go about it in a very different way. And, we have different likes and dislikes. And so that's one of the things I thought would be fun to talk about. Duke, you mentioned something about being, relatively new to dynasty baseball. And what did you like about it? What attracted you to it that was different than, for example, redrafts or keeper leagues for you?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is the fact that you basically have so many different options as far as strategy goes. Redraft, especially Roto, there's really only like one or two strategies you can take to build a team that can actually win. And there's a couple like kooky ones like the Marmol strategy and a couple crazy things you can do, but it's really just kind of like, I hate to say this because I still love Roto, but it's kind of like redraft Roto is just kind of luck of the draw. Like you're just kind of hoping that the players you draft don't get injured. And if they don't, then you're going to have a good season. And if they do, you're kind of screwed. But in Dynasty, like you're never out of it. Like nobody should be checking out in like August and September, even if you're in last place, because there's things you can be doing to build for next year. So it's true, like 10, 11 month a year commitment.
You sound a little bit like Joe and saying from the Dodgers and saying that it's luck based in terms of Roto, at least. So I'm sure he kick out of that.
Redraft, it really is just like luck of the draw with the injuries. And I mean, yes, there are things you can do to like, for player evaluation and things like that to make sure you set yourself up for the best chance to win. But I just, a lot of people just check out by the All-Star break. And I hated that.
All right. So for you, it sounds like it's really kind of the extra dynamic of like planning for this year, next year, and 5 years from now. That's kind of interesting to you.
Yeah, 100%. And then I kind of just got sucked into the whole prospect evaluation, trading, speculation side of it, which is super fun. And because I love baseball, it kind of just adds a different flavor to it.
Yeah, for me, the dynasty aspect, the thing that I like the best out of it, I mean, I like all the things that you identified as well. But it's really enriched my enjoyment of baseball because I feel much more connected to the game by like studying these prospects. And then when they get promoted, I know who they are, even if they're not on my team. And, I can have conversations with my friends. And now my friends will call me when one of the prospects for their team gets called up and hey, is this guy any good? Right. So they're going to me for that. And, that's kind of fun and to be, that plugged into these players. And oftentimes from when they're 16 years old, all the way to reaching the majors. And you learn a lot about different systems and how baseball teams are actually constructed. And then you try to emulate that with your dynasty team with varying degrees of success or failure. But what about you, Jeff? I see you're shaking your head a lot. I'm curious to hear from you about what you like about it. Nope. You think you're on mute, big guy.
Thank you. I played fantasy football for a long time before fantasy baseball, and that fantasy football really is very luck based. To me, fantasy baseball is like so much more interesting, and you can really geek out on the numbers. I know people that don't even really like baseball that love fantasy baseball just because you can look for the patterns in the numbers and come up with so many different strategies, like Duke was saying. And the dynasty aspect of it is the best part. Following the prospects, valuing them yourself, figuring out how your rankings kind of line up against the market, working dynasty trades, and of course, like you mentioned, kind of following these kids from when they're 16, 17 years old up to the point when they actually make the majors, and trying to be patient enough to not give up on them when they struggle right away. And it just kind of like, I went to some spring training games for the first time this year and saw a lot of prospects that, I knew that I would never have known if I didn't play dynasty baseball.
Yep.
I was kind of talking to some of the old timers who were sitting next to me at the game and being like, oh no, this kid's going to be great. I know all about him, and the kid hasn't even got out of low A ball yet, so it's
fun.
It's just fun to geek out on, man.
Yeah. If you love baseball, you're going to love dynasty and prospects, and you can really dig into it. And there is that strategy element that Duke was mentioning as well, and we'll get into that a little bit tonight. So look, we have a lot to cover this evening. I set a very ambitious agenda for episode 1, and we're really going to cover a handful of topics, but each one of them will be a deep dive. We're going to talk about the ABL Prospect Handbook, which is my brainchild and probably going to end up being the bane of my existence creating this thing. But we're also going to be talking about our general prospecting strategies and approaches, as well as the ABL Prospect Draft that we just concluded very recently. And I'm interested in hearing about some of your crushes and fades, as I like to call them, that we had going into the draft, and seeing what you guys thought would work or didn't work. So look, I think it makes sense to start with the ABL Prospect Handbook. And I'll put that up on the screen for people so they can see it, and then we can talk about it. But like I said, this is a very ambitious endeavor on my part, and it's an attempt to really kind of and there's Jordan Walker, the #1 prospect in the ABL handbook. And we can talk a little bit about Jordan and the intense hype that is going on about him right now in drafts. I was just in a NFBC draft this weekend, and Jordan Walker went for $13, which I thought was incredible on a 260 budget. And this is a league that is purportedly involving a lot of experts. It shows kind of the enthusiasm of prospects and the hype machine that is fantasy baseball. But to talk about the Prospect Handbook a little bit more, to set up our discussion, it's really an effort to rate all 600 prospects that were held in ABL on a certain date. This date was February 23rd this year. And I had to pick a control date because people are crazy about trades in this league. Otherwise, I would have been constantly updating it. But I really tried to objectively rate the prospects on 6 different criteria. And then each of those criteria were rated, and they're on the screen now. The driving force with 80% was the overall scouting grade from 2 major sources, Baseball America, Baseball HQ. I could have picked other sources. Those are 2 sources that I trust and I've used many times over the years. They're kind of my bread and butter. So I use them. And since it was my handbook, I got to pick for better or worse. And then the next biggest factor at 8% was the ceiling risk factor. In other words, what is the risk that the prospect isn't going to achieve his grade? And, the level of potential that he has. So those are the 2 biggest factors at 88% total, which really tried to anchor the grades to skill and risk. And you'll see the other elements there all relate to those factors to one degree or another as well. So really almost 100% is related to skill or risk. That was the idea. And we'll talk about how this played out and kind of what that resulted in, because I think the Prospect Handbook is certainly, as I put in the introduction, not perfect. We can talk about things that we thought were kind of anomalous or outliers. And I'm thinking about ways to improve it for next year. And interested in everybody's suggestions in doing so. But, one of the things we were able to do with the Prospect Guide is generate ranking systems for the entire league. And, with a numeric number, And that's basically the aggregate of all the prospects on a given team's roster. And you can see tonight we've got 3 of the top 6 teams, according to the handbook at least, in the Pirates, the Orioles, and the Cardinals, and just a handful of teams, as you can see here, are over 100. The prospect guide basically rates prospects on a scale of 1 to 10. And so if you're over 100, that means you're doing pretty well, is the aggregate for your 20 prospects. And before we get into the nitty gritty and the the actual ratings and whether you guys thought there were surprises, I should also note that because I rated every prospect, you can get a top 100 based on the numbers. And we can talk about what stood out there as maybe kind of crazy or in line with what we thought. And don't be shy about, critiquing it. That's fine. But I wanted to talk generally about your guys' reaction to the general approach that I adopted, and what thoughts you might have about that. So I don't know, Jeff, you want to go first?
Sure, Stephen. I wanted to ask, when you were going through that, and we haven't talked about this yet, but for your ceiling risk factor, I mean, is that just your personal opinion, or was that gathered kind of from Baseball America?
No, not at all. Yeah, so I tried to remove myself, my biases entirely from the process. So these grades were based on Baseball America's grades or Baseball HQ's grade. It's actually an aggregate of the two. Each of those publications assigns a risk score to the prospect. If you got into the weeds on it, what you'd see is that Baseball America tends to be a little bit more conservative in giving a grade to a prospect, whereas Baseball HQ will tend to give a higher grade, but will assign a higher risk factor. So they hedge their grade with the risk, and Baseball America hedges the risk with their grades, if you will. And so I find using the two of those sources to be particularly useful because they are in some ways a check against each other. That's how I came up with it. It's entirely their grades. And you could disagree with the grades, but these are grades based on a lot of scouting that these organizations do, these publications do, and so I tend to trust them. Okay,
well, that's fair, and I'm glad to hear that. And I really appreciate you putting this together and putting the time into it, Stephen. I think it's awesome. I very firmly believe that when it comes to anything extra anyone wants to do from the podcast, for ABL or any fantasy league, anyone that wants to spend their own private time putting something like this together, or doing other podcasts or doing other rankings, it's just amazing. Like that should be celebrated as part of what makes a league like this so great. As for your rankings themselves, I thought it was interesting, right? It definitely reflects kind of your own personal beliefs that scouting should be kind of like the top thing that you ever look at when it comes to a prospect. And I don't necessarily agree with that 100%, but I appreciate it, and it's certainly a factor for me when I'm doing my own evaluations. But you can kind of see there are certain names that really pop on your list, and we can get into that as it goes, as being higher than I would expect, and other names that are lower than it.
Yeah, we can get into it now if you want, since you brought it up. And I'm interested, before you do that, Jeff, like what role do you think scouting plays in your process? You're correct in saying it's very high on my list. And this definitely reflects that bias, if you will. But I'm curious as to what you think about it and how you integrate it into your process.
I mean, if you would put it at an 80% for your own rankings, I would probably put it at about a 33% for mine. And there are other things that factor in that kind of scouting are a part of, like looking at other people's rankings and whatnot, which I know that you tend to downplay that, but I mean, it is helpful for me at times. And I know some of that is scouting driven as well, but I don't know about the scouting on a high school kid, for example. I don't put a lot of trust into it, or a kid in the Dominican that's never seen, professional level pitching. So putting a high scouting grade on that, is something that I'm skeptical of and always will be. And it'll kind of, to me, I definitely am going to weigh actual production in professional baseball far more than scouting. I'm going to look at stats. I'm going to look at stats throughout the year. I have a lot of dynasty teams, and on a regular checkpoint, at least kind of every 3 or 4 weeks, I'm kind of going through and seeing how they're all performing and whether or not they're living up to expectations, whether or not it's age appropriate, if it's level appropriate, if they just got promoted. I'm digging deep into performance as well on top of that.
Yep.
And yeah, that's just part of how I do things.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And look, I think that performance is very hard to quantify in terms of what I was trying to do as an exercise. And I talked with this about Duke when I was first kind of thinking of doing this. And I don't know if you remember this conversation, Duke, we had over DM back in the summer, actually. My thought was the best I could do is to have performance baked into the overall grade. Because when these grades get re-released, they tend to change based on performance. And so that's the best way I could think of to integrate performance. But I agree with you, Jeff. Part of my process, and I think I highlighted this in the handbook, this does not mimic entirely what I do. So I definitely look at performance numbers and factor that in. So I wouldn't say that scouting is 80% of my process. It's 80% of what the handbook does. But it's certainly a very high percentage. It's more than 33%, if you will. And we can get to the individual players in a second that popped. I want to hear from Duke, but before we do that, we had a question from the audience, and I'm pretty sure this is Sam who asked this. And let me just stop the screen sharing for a second so we can see his question. He asked, or we should be able to see it. He asked, here it is. If you're taking questions from the audience, which we are, Sam, curious about the 70, 45, 40 drop off and why the delta was so big. So, Sam's referring specifically to the scores I gave to the various overall rankings, and I can go back to that on the screen. So let me hide his comment, and we'll go back to the shared screen for a second, and I'll put this up on the screen. The guide tries to rate people based on the scores for the prospect that they get, and it goes from 10 down to 0, and 50, which is an average grade, gets a 4. And my thought process, there's no science to this. If you want, this is me assigning points, right? My thinking was that if you're getting a 45, which is a below average grade, that has very minimal value from a fantasy standpoint. But it's not no value. So I assign that as a 1. If you're below 45, which is pretty far below average, I just gave you a 0 because you're basically below replacement level. So I thought actually a 0, I could have gone negative, right? But I gave a 0 too. 55 is above average ball player. And I think those are worth roughly twice as much as a regular average ball player is. And then 9, 9.5, and 10 are not a tremendous increase over above average, but they're incremental. I could have gone lower with 55 to create more of a gap or a delta, and maybe that's a fair criticism of it. And yeah, Sam, Sam's clarifying his question in the comments, and I got it, Sam. And it's really, again, not a science, but this is just how I chose to do it, to really kind of place the greatest value on above average to star players. And if somebody's getting a 70 grade, and they're very rare that somebody gets a 70 grade, that was the thinking behind that. But thank you for the question, Sam. And happy to answer any questions about, the handbook and the process behind the handbook. So, I'm interested, Duke, in hearing from you about what your thoughts are about the, about the handbook and questions that you had.
Yeah, I think I'll echo a lot of what Jeff said. I think, first of all, this is awesome. The fact that we have so many people in this league kind of with their own pet projects, whether it's a podcast or power rankings, or this is like the 3rd or 4th attempt at ranking prospects and prospects, minor league systems and things like that. So it's really awesome that we have so many people doing these kind of side projects, which just, I think, makes this league, that's what kind of sets this league apart from other leagues. And I would put this league up against any 30-team dynasty league in the entire world. Like, I just can't imagine a better league than this. So, so first of all, thanks for that. And I know this took a lot of time to put together, so I think it's awesome. And
Thank you. It was fun. It did take a lot of time,
yeah,
but
sure.
I enjoyed it because I love prospects. But go ahead. I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. So I I had similar questions to Jeff, because there's a lot of different ways to kind of tackle a project like this. And I think you kind of have to balance having, the best methodology with like how much time you can actually commit to it. And I think the way you did it is a good way to kind of strike that balance, because it's it's not like you're combing through YouTube videos watching clips of 16-year-old kids in the
I'm
deep
not,
end.
but I know somebody who does.
Right. But but just kind of pulling from sources that you trust and taking your own subjectivity out of it as much as you can anyway, I think is a good way to do it. And as far as my approach, if I was doing something like this, I'm probably similar to Jeff in that I value the scouting reports, especially on BA. I've tried to get into Baseball HQ a little bit. I do have a membership there, but I just find maybe I'm just so used to BA and navigating that website. I just haven't really gotten a whole lot into Baseball HQ, but I do value those scouting reports and I read them a lot. But at the same time, I value performance quite a bit more. And really, when I'm the thing that is, I think the downside of this is it's more of like a review of last season and not necessarily predictive of this season. So to identify, like last year, I was on Jackson Merrill really early. And it wasn't because of like scouting reports and highlight videos. It was because of what he was doing in like complex and low A. So I think I had Jackson Merrill in all my leagues before anybody else was on him. So it's not like this prospect guide isn't necessarily predictive, but it is a good snapshot of where people are like at, whatever that cutoff date was that you selected. So
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, in fact, in the introduction, I actually describe it exactly as that. It's a snapshot,
Right.
and it is not, it can't be predictive, really. And it'd be folly to try to predict what these prospects are going to do. And I'm 100% with you in terms of tracking performance. And that's certainly how I identify guys to pick up off the wire, hopefully for nothing. And, then see them, mature. And I was on to Yuri Perez, ages before other people were in my other leagues. When you hit like on a Jackson Merrill or Yuri Perez, it's really nice because all the hard work gets rewarded. And, it's kind of a marriage of both diligence and keeping up on the performance and being mindful of the type of performance that matters. And the scouting grades, which can reinform the performance and giving you some confidence that it's not, a small sample size or driven by some kind of anomaly, but is actually based by skills. Or at least that's how I think about it. And going forward, I've thought about, making this a bit more comprehensive. It would require more work for me, but I've thought about weighting individual skill scores, and because I think some of them are more important than others. And
100%.
There are certain skills that if you really lack, and I'll talk about a few players that jump out in this regard to me on the top 100 list. If you really lack those skills, it's almost impossible for you to make, a real impact in the majors. Or there's a real risk that you'll never reach the majors. Right. So we'll talk about that as well. Why don't we look at the farm systems themselves, and just I'm curious if you guys thought anything jumped out as odd on this list, or as maybe being consistent with generally how you viewed, whether you view Jeff above or below me or whatever. That doesn't really matter so much to me. I'm just curious what your guys' reaction was to this list, and if you thought anyone was like, just geez, that surprised me.
No major surprises for me. Obviously, Harry just loaded up at the auction, so not surprising at all to see him at the top. Brendan's been doing a fantastic job. He somehow was able to be very competitive last year and even better this year, while at the same time trading for a lot of top prospects and early draft picks. So I'm not surprised to see him there. Duke's minor league has been a powerhouse since this league began. He's made amazing trades to restock it. Yeah,
Yeah,
Oakland.
Duke has somehow won the league twice and built a juggernaut farm system, which is terrifying. So, that's why I call him the Godfather coming into the podcast.
It's all about the trades. Yeah, Duke is the
all,
master of the dynasty trades for sure.
But he's only 4 years in. Imagine what he's going to be like in 10 years. It's going to be scary. So, what about you, Duke? Did you have any reactions to this? Anything jump out to you?
No, I'll throw a little shade at Brendan. Not really throwing shade. I'm just he sniped me on somebody last night and I'm still not over it. And we're doing a draft in another league right now. So, I wasn't feeling great yesterday. So I passed out at like 11:30 and I was winning Seth Brown for $10 and I slept in because I wasn't feeling great. And I woke up and I was like, oh, sweet. I won Brown. And then I looked and he must've beat my bid right after I fell asleep because while I was sleeping, he had cleared the board.
Well,
and Brendan won him.
Well, the end of that story may be that Brown ends up platooning this year.
So. Maybe it'll work out for me, man. But Brendan has a really, really good farm system, but I'd have to look at some of these individual players to see where you rank them to see how he got to be number 2. Yeah. A lot of his guys are like FYPD guys because obviously he had a bunch of picks this year in the first round. Like DePaula, which I don't really know much about DePaula and DeLauder and Parada, some really highly regarded FYPD guys.
Yep.
And then he has like Casey Schmidt, who I love, which most people don't really know a whole lot about. So maybe he's has a higher rank in your rankings or something like that. But
he has Gavin Williams too. I know that.
Yeah, he's got some nice pitching with Williams, and I'm assuming Williams and Rodriguez are like the main reasons why his system.
Gavin Williams got a big score for him.
Yeah,
that's certainly true. And we could pull his team up on the handbook, but I know from doing the rankings that Gavin Williams, really elevated his team. He has a couple players that were over 8.
Right.
And if you go to we can go to the next page and, I can show the top 100. I think you're going to see his name in there, his team name in there quite a bit. I mean, there's Gavin Williams right there. He's number 8 on the list.
Yeah. And you've got Rodriguez at 3. And I mean, it's a really, really good farm system. I was just surprised it was number 2.
Yeah.
Go ahead. He was not on my radar for like a potential number 1 system.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things is I was just doing these spreadsheets without really kind of checking to see who would end up being number 1, number 2, or whatever. I had a rough sense of, kind of where things were shaking out. But what was really interesting to me was this list, the top 100 list, because when I put it together and I finally collated all the names and sorted it from highest to lowest, Jordan Walker was at the top. And as a Cardinals fan, I was very happy to see that, even though my rankings don't really matter. I was glad to see that. And then my boy Yuri Perez was number 2, which made me very happy.
I'm sure you turned the knobs until those 2 were at the top, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things that was interesting to me was that there were 5 pitchers in the top 10. And there is a pocket of the dynasty community that really resists drafting pitchers and even rostering them. I mean, if you go through some of the teams and even our league, there are some teams that have very few pitchers rostered at all. And it was just interesting to me that here, at least in this system, 5 of the top 10 guys were starting pitchers. And then one name that jumped out to me was Tink Hence, which I highlighted there, which is very high. I love Tink Hence. I think he's got a bright future, and I hope he does as a Cardinal fan. And Jeff, I know you do too, and because you're a Cardinals fan. But we talk about Tink from time to time via DM and think he's got a lot of upside. But I was really surprised to see him at 17. That struck me as maybe pumping the brakes a little bit. And I'd have to go look at his individual scouting numbers to see if there's some things I might downgrade him on. But I know he has a couple of very lively pitches, and Baseball America is very high on him. I know, Jeff, you might want to talk about the other names I have highlighted there. which is James Wood and Griff McGarry being tied on the list at 34. And I know you mentioned to me you thought Wood was lower than you expected. Where would you think he'd be on this list?
Not because I myself am that high on him. It's just that the dynasty community as a whole has him generally top 10, even top 5 right now. Just I think people see Aaron Judge 2.0 kind of when they see the big guy that can crush the ball, that has all the tools, and I'm surprised to see him down the list a little bit. I'm surprised to see like even Marco Luciano ahead of him, because Marco certainly has, and he's on my team in ABL, and he certainly has the pedigree from a scout's perspective. But he does not have the numbers at all to justify that high of a ranking. He's generally has a lot of injury problems. Even when he's been in there, he's been pretty mediocre. I was noting that some names that I thought were pretty higher than I would expect on your list. Bobby Miller all the way at the top, and I know I've seen some pieces on Baseball America that he's got multiple pitches, or like some of the best pitches in all the minors, and that's why he's there. But kind of like I feel like the Dodgers crank out pitchers like that guy all the time. And,
well, that doesn't mean they're not good, but, but yes,
it doesn't. But I'm surprised certainly to see him all the way in the top 5 like you have him.
Yeah, no, he's certainly high up. I think one of the things that's probably worth noting about what I did was the proximity was a factor, as well as the system they're in, and it's the Dodgers. And the Dodgers are a very highly regarded and rated farm system in Baseball America, so that certainly helped. And he hasn't had injury issues, which also helped him. So there's a lower risk, which bumped him up a little bit in the rankings. And I think for James Wood, he went to Washington, which is one of the worst farm systems in the last 3 years on average. So that took him down a little bit, right? He also had some injury issues, which the way I did this calculation brought him down just a little bit. And those fractions, even though they're small, can bring you down the list when you look at it.
I know that you were talking about pitching prospects being faded by some dynasty people, and I try not to do that too much, but you say a pitcher has not had injury problems. I mean, all pitchers have injury problems at some point. I mean,
well, they can. I mean, there's a famous saying: there are 2 types of pitching prospects: injured prospects and ones who are going to be injured.
Right. So some people think it's kind of a good thing if they've already gotten their TJ out of the way, because that means you're not going to lose 2 years down the road. Yep. And I get that. I traded for Max Meyer in ABL because I still believe, and he's over halfway through his recovery, and I think the kid's dynamite. So
yeah, I think what you're highlighting though, Jeff, is like there's a difference, and this is an important distinction. I think that, what you're really highlighting is roster construction strategies, right? Which is divorced from a prospect's skills. Right, you're talking about another element of risk in terms of what you're willing to accept in constructing your roster, right? And that's completely valid, I think. Yeah. I mean, and I think that there's a lot of sense in not overemphasizing pitching in your approach, because there is higher volatility. In terms of skills, I mean, these pitchers can be even more skilled than the hitters, right? They just have an added element of risk because pitching is an inherently dangerous activity.
Everybody's not meant to work like that. There's no question. And I mean, you see things like Andrew Painter was the belle of the ball 2 weeks ago, and everybody wanted him, and we thought he was going to bust in the majors, and then suddenly gets pulled out of a game out of nowhere, no sign that was going to happen ahead of time, and he's health for months, and reasonable chance that he could have surgery if rest doesn't work, and then he'll be gone forever, or for a year and a half or so. Yeah. So but everyone knows how much I've fallen in love with Tiedemann, and I've posted tons of stuff about him in the chat room and watched all the stuff. And I know Duke has him in ABL, but like I fall in love with pitching prospects too. I'm not immune to it.
Yeah. I hear that. I'm just as guilty of falling in love with them too. And I'm actually, as we'll talk about later, out of the 3 of us, probably the most willing to take risk when it comes to prospects in terms of roster construction. I just wanted to touch on one thing on this list that I highlighted was Griff McGarry. And he's kind of the poster child for what would change if I developed a deeper dive on the grades, because he has a very low control grade. I think it's like 40 in Baseball America. And that would drop him substantially in the list. It'd probably take him off the list. for me. So I just wanted to point that out for everybody's consumption, that, as I said in the introduction, this is certainly not perfect. And going to Duke's point, like, you pick the level of abstraction that's not going to bury you in work putting this together. But if I do this in a deeper way next year, that's a change in C. So you'd be right out of there. Duke, I don't know if you had anything to add before we move on to general strategy.
No, I think I had kind of the same observations. 5 of the top 10 were pitchers. I counted 19 of the top 50 were pitchers. I get everything you're saying. Like, you have to invest in the pitching. Like, I don't win the chip in year one if I don't have Alek Manoah. Like, that just doesn't, it's not going to happen. So, I mean, you have to, and we can get more into this when we start talking about strategy, but you have to invest in the pitching. You have to have a balanced minor league system if you want to be competitive. So yeah, like, you can't forget about the pitchers. You got to give them some love as well. But yeah, I think there's a really, really good chance Bobby Miller is a reliever.
That's another risk factor. I agree. Yeah. And go ahead.
Yeah, like, I get it. You're trying to be objective. You're just following the scores that the scouts give and using your system. But like Miller, the ones that I was kind of surprised, just kind of glancing at the list, was Miller, obviously. Jackson Jobe, I think, is in the top 20. He's done nothing, basically. He's been very mediocre. As much as I love Mason Hour, like, he's my boy. I have him in ABL and some other leagues. I was on him very early.
Yep.
But I think he's like in the top 40 or something like that.
Yep. That was totally Baseball America driven.
Yeah, like Baseball America loves him.
Yeah,
rightly so. He's a good ball player.
Yeah, funny story about Mason Hour. I mean, so you and I were DMing with each other about ad drops, and you told me you were going to add Mason Hour, and he was a guy I was adding in all my other dynasty leagues. And because you told me you were going to add him, I didn't put a claim in. So
I guess they owe you.
I was like, I can't do that, right? I was like, all right. But I think he's the one league I'm in where I don't have him. It's ABL. It's because you fronted it. So
that's funny. I didn't know that.
Yeah, let's talk about our next agenda item, which is prospect approaches. And one of the things, like I said at the outset of this, which really interested me about having this conversation with the three of us, is that it's pretty clear if you look at our rosters of prospects, and just from our conversations with each other, we have kind of different approaches in assembling rosters and thinking about prospects. And yet I think we're all, effective to one degree or another. And I think we like talking with each other about prospects because there is that different perspective that you get on people. So what I'm interested, hearing from each one of you is, what are the key factors? Jeff, you already touched on it a little bit. I'm going to start with Duke. Duke, I mean, my outsider sense looking at your roster and talking with you is you're very proximity driven and data driven and performance driven, right? But how would you describe, you don't have to agree with that, but how would you describe your approach generally, and what factors, are really kind of key drivers for you?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. I think proximity it's not the most important thing to me, but it is important. But I say that not because I only want a bunch of guys who are in AAA and a bunch of guys who are going to debut this year. Mm-hmm. Because you have to balance your proximity on it's really about building a balanced minor league roster in Dynasty, I think. I'm not concerned, and I from talking to you, Steve, I know this is something you are concerned about, or at least you have been in the past. Like, I'm not concerned about the positions of the hitters. I'm more concerned about like having a good age and level spread. Uh-huh. So I'm okay if I have 6 shortstops, which I might even have 6. I think I have 6 shortstops in like ARL. Like, that doesn't bother me at all because they're all kind of spread out. I have some like a 16-year-old and I have like some 22-year-olds, like all and everything in between. So
I would describe my concern about position, not so much in which positions I hold. I mean, there can be some times when I want to make sure I've got somebody in the pipeline. But if you look at my roster, I think I have mostly center fielders and shortstops. And I tend to draft them because they're the best players on the field, generally speaking. That's where they put the best athletes. But I share your concern about age and what level they're at, which is certainly something I integrated in the handbook. But it's something I do a lot more. When I look at prospects, we can talk about my system and what I do, a little bit later. But the only position I get concerned about not overemphasizing is catcher, and I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of nice if you can find that's why I pursued Melendez so hard in ABLs, because I knew he was going to be playing positions other than catcher.
Yep.
And that's why I have Andy Rodriguez in a bunch of leagues, because I think he's going to be playing maybe some first base, maybe even second base, maybe left field. Like, he's going to be playing all over the place.
Yeah, he could be the Craig Biggio, right, of this generation, right?
Yeah. So yeah, catchers, I don't, and we'll talk about that during the ABL draft. Actually, I can dive more into my philosophy on catchers, but the other thing that I really care about is and it's one of your criteria. But for me, it's way more than like 2% or 3% or whatever you have. And that's the age of the prospect compared to the level they're in.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is probably I'm giving my strategies away now. So for whoever's watching this, you know what I look for, but that is probably the most important thing for me when I'm looking for prospects on the wire, is the kids, the kids who are doing well as an 18-year-old in an 18-year-old in like high A. Like, I'm going to be all over that kid if he's doing well. So that's really important to me. And I've seen data that says that is very telling of future success in the major leagues, is the kids who do well at a younger age compared to the rest of the players they're playing with. So, and then there's there's certain stats I look at when I'm combing the Fangraphs for looking for prospects, or when I'm evaluating my own prospects. I'm afraid how much I'm going to give away here, but
only say what you're comfortable saying. You don't have to say anything.
I've said this before, so I don't think I'm giving anything away, but walk versus strikeout rate.
Yeah.
For pitchers and hitters is like the most important stat to me. So, a hitter that's, walking 10% of the time and striking out less than 25% of the time I'm way more interested in him than, the kid who's hitting 30 home runs, but striking out 30% of the time.
Yep. It's interesting you say that, because those are stats that I look at as well. The K percentage mine is based on ball percentage, which some people talk about as being command. But decide whether that actually is command or not. That's the ratio I look at. That's very important. And for hitters, I look at batting eye too, which people often refer to that ratio of walks, strikeouts minus walks. And age relative to level is certainly a topic that's very important to me. And certainly more important than it is in the handbook to me. And as I said, the handbook does not mirror exactly what I do. The way I dealt with it in the handbook was to add a full extra point to a player's score pre-weight, which actually is pretty meaningful when you think about the math to do that on that score, because it's hard to objectively give too much weight to that in the exercise that I was doing, because so many prospects are at the level they should be at age-wise. So you get a lot of zeros, and it would create a real spike. Maybe you could do it that way. It'd be interesting to see how the numbers would change. But I can tell you this, like Jordan Walker and Yuri Perez are at the top of that list, and they're both a lot younger than the average age, of what they should be. So it definitely played some role. Jeff, what about you? What are your kind of likes, dislikes, factors that are key to you, your general philosophies about, accumulating prospects and tracking them down?
Yeah, a couple things. When I'm constructing a roster, I'm looking for a few different things. I'm looking for potential fast risers. You know, people that will gain a lot of momentum in the fantasy industry, that will jump from being ranked 150th to being ranked top 50 in the next year. And I think I got a bunch of guys on my team that have the capability of doing that, and across all my dynasty teams, really. Some of the names that I'm really been trying to get this offseason are players, and it's certainly a risk. There's no guarantee that players like Gabriel Gonzalez and Anthony Gutierrez and Carlos Jorge and players that I really like and have things that I really like about them are going to ascend like that. But I think that there's a good chance that they do, as good a chance as anybody at their ranking.
Why are you focused on where they're ascending to? I mean, are you thinking about them in terms of being able to trade them, or
That's part of it? Yeah, I mean, in dynasty, trading is definitely a part of it. You know, and there's always a place in the league that's drafting right now, which is Breaking Bats. It's an ABL league, and in that league, there was kind of an arms race right before the playoffs last year, and Duke and myself and Adam and about 3 other teams pretty much unloaded our entire farms trying to compete with each other because it was a $500 prize for winning the regular season. So we all went a little nuts, and none of us have any prospects left because of it. That's not typical, you know. It's just kind of the way that league was constructed. But in general, you know, it's you're looking for trade capital, and you're looking for people to contribute and come up. Obviously, Duke and ABL has had a lot of his team come up and contribute as minor leagues, and then you can sign them for cheap for many years, you know, and that's a huge value in a league like this.
Yeah, no, for sure.
In addition to fast risers, you know, I'm looking for proximity pitching too. You know, that's a part of it for me because of the high bust rate with prospect pitching and the high injury rate. If you can find guys that are on the cusp, you know, that were very successful in AA and AAA and like are going to be next man up for their major league teams. And I have a few of those guys. I have Wilmer Flores and Andrew Abbott and a few others that I think are going to definitely make starts for their major league teams this year. I don't know how good they'll be. You never know. But it's Bryce Miller. Bryce Miller, I think, will actually be really good. He's a little bit further away. But if you can find proximity pitching in a dynasty league, I think that's pretty valuable. It's overall process for me. You know, I play in a lot of leagues. I think that helps from dynasty. You just play in like one dynasty league, you know, it's kind of really hard to do a total deep dive of the whole player pool. If you play in a lot of leagues, if you play in like 5 or more, then you're probably have exposure to tons of players, and it's pretty cool when you find a name through your research, through looking on Twitter or Baseball America or buried in an article somewhere. You know, you can start to dig in on this player, and you can check across all your leagues, and you might find somewhere where you can pick them up. And that's always exciting.
That's why I call this like, you know, a podcast about prospecting, right? Because you're digging for gold all the time, and that's part of the fun, right? It's like the gold rush. You go out west and you start digging. And I think, you know, one of the other advantages of being in a lot of leagues is that you actually learn from the other owners.
For sure.
Right. So, you know, you have a conversation like the Mason Hour conversation that I had with Duke. You know, what was interesting about that is like we each kind of came to that player separately through our own process, and then there's confirmation. Right. Through the conversation, I was like, oh, Duke likes him too. Like, you know, I'm glad I picked him up. Right. And you also learn from other people picking up prospects. There are certain owners you come to respect in terms of their, you know, acumen for identifying prospects, and you see them do it in one league. And if you're smart, you go to your other leagues and you start checking, you know, and that educational process, I think, from being in other leagues is really valuable and just kind of fun because it does, I think, necessitate you learning a lot about the players.
I was going to say,
go ahead.
We talk about lists a lot. You know, there's these prospect lists out there. There's, you know, Eric Cross and the Welsh and a bunch of other lists that are out there of top 400, top 500 that are constantly updated, and those have dubious value, right? All of those folks kind of have their own like if you follow them for a while, you can understand their own preferences. Like James Anderson and RotoWire is going to have his speed guys at the top, and I don't really dig speed guys that much personally. Like I don't really trust minor league stolen bases. You know, it's like the pitchers aren't good at throwing them out, and it's a lot different when they get in the majors. But from those lists, the main value to me is finding names that I don't know about. So as I peruse these lists month to month, you see a name that suddenly moved up from 400 to 200. I'm like, there's probably a reason why, you know, and it's worth kind of looking into what was their thought process for moving them up. And you might not have realized that player was ascending the way they are, you know, like you might not be following the Brewers single A game to see the Jackson Cheerios going bananas. But if
Right.
you follow those lists, you might notice that, hey, they moved Cheerio up. What's going on with this guy? And you could
Yes,
dig in.
I often find, maybe your experience is different, Jeff. I often find by the time they move up the list, it's too late.
Yeah.
That the news is integrated into the community such that somebody's already started claiming these guys. But I think you're right. If you know, it can help you identify players.
Right. It does for me, for sure. And like, I mean, maybe not once they're in the top 100, 150, sure, everybody knows about them. But you'll see guys that kind of like appear on the list out of nowhere, that weren't even in the top 500, that suddenly these guys have it at number 230. And you're like, who is this guy? And,
yeah. I think one thing that's worth highlighting, from this conversation amongst the three of us, is just how much work you put into reading about prospects and thinking about prospects and different sources you consult, and whatever those sources are.
Right.
You can consult lists. I don't rely on the list as much as you do.
Yeah.
You know, there's no right or wrong answer, but you spend a lot of time thinking about this. I spend an hour every morning over cups of coffee reading about baseball every day, 365. You know, my wife, calls herself a baseball widow. And there are other times of the year that I spend more time. This prospect guide was a labor of love, because I just like reading about them. And, one of the things I do to identify prospects early is to read Baseball America religiously and very carefully. And I know, Duke, you do this too, because we've talked about some players as they've been highlighted in, BA. But that's how I identify players like Jackson Churio. There's a guy on my roster right now that I don't think anybody's heard of, named Angel Benitez, who's a pitcher for the Yankees. Yeah, there you go. I own him every night.
Because of Baseball America, he was on their like hot 20 several times last year.
Yeah. And so that's right. And so that's how I first learned about him. I learned about Yuri Paris the same way, and I rostered Angel. He hasn't, popped in any of the lists yet. But I love tall pitchers who throw hard and have decent command. And Yuri fits that bill, and Angel is kind of out of the same mold. Another guy in this draft I really love for the same reasons was Noah Schultz, who I nabbed in most leagues, although not in ABL, thanks to Brendan, who got him in on the Royals roster. But yeah, I mean, I go about it probably in a little bit different way, identifying the players than you do, Jeff. But that's what I do, and I'd say the big difference to me in terms of our relative approaches is that I'm much more risk tolerant, and I love J15s. And I spend a lot of time reading about them. They're highly volatile, and I'm the first to concede that it's high risk, but also potentially high reward. And hopefully the acquisition cost is low. And that's the trade-off. And I also take that approach with pitching. I try to get my marquee, prospects on the pitching side without having to spend a high draft pick, with some exceptions. But it's pretty rare for me to have a pitcher ranked in the top 10 in the draft, because of the risk factors that you identified, Jeff. But going to your proximity point, at the end of our regular draft or auction, I nabbed Mason Miller of the A's. It was a prospect that I like a lot and is right on the cusp of the majors, and so I bid on him in that rather than have to draft him. But that was certainly a driving factor for Mason and why I did that.
I have Miller on a lot of teams as well. I obviously Oakland staff is pretty bad, so he's got a good shot at coming up this year.
Yeah. But, that kind of brings us into the draft itself, which was something else I wanted to, talk about today. And I'm just, curious as an initial matter, what's your general draft process? I know that you guys each had actually relatively few picks. Duke, you had one this year, and I'll talk about that too. And Jeff, you had 3. So maybe your approach this year was a little bit different than it was in prior years, but I'm just wondering when you kind of start the prep process in the normal course, and very generally speaking, what's the outline of that for you guys? And maybe this time, Duke, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I did very little prep. To be perfectly honest, I only had a couple picks in all my leagues. And I'm, so in this league I ended up with, after a bunch of wheeling and dealing, I ended up with the 11th pick. Do you want me to talk about that now, or do you want to dive into that?
Yeah, no, we can do it. Look, you're on the subject. I mean, this is, we'll get to Jeff's draft in a second. So maybe we can do this. We'll just do this in silos. You had the number 1 overall pick. right?
Yep.
Through the lottery. We have a lottery in this league, and so the bottom 14 teams, kind of like the NBA, go into a virtual ping pong ball machine, and they get picked, and you got the lucky ball. You have one chance to get the number 1 pick, and you got it. And many people were envious, and I can tell you because I ended up with the number 2 pick, and I was very glad, Duke, that you got the number 1 pick, because I knew there was no way in hell that you were going to take the guy I wanted. And then when you traded out the pick, I was like, damn, like now I have to worry about it. But what was your thought process on trading down? I mean, you have a very obviously competitive roster because you won the league. So that may have been a factor. What was your thought process? You tell me.
I think if I had to do it over again, I don't know that I would have traded down, because I've kind of fallen in love with Jackson Holiday a little bit. And when I traded the pick, obviously this was back in like early January when we did the lottery, and I think I traded the pick shortly thereafter. And just kind of hearing about how much more he's grown, like he's still growing, he's getting bigger, he's getting stronger. Like I think I probably would have kept that pick and taken Holiday if the draft was like 2 months later than it was.
Yep.
But I also am a big Hunter Brown fan. And so I traded that pick for Hunter Brown, Quinn Priester, and another first rounder. And it seemed like kind of a no-brainer at the time, just because, and it looks like that's going to work out okay for me because Hunter Brown's I don't know what he's done this spring, but he's probably going to be in the rotation.
It's a good shot. They got a couple other guys the Astros could slug in there too.
McCullers is hurt. He's going to be in there.
Yeah, McCullers is hurt. He's going to get an opportunity there, and that's nice. They have Brian Abreu who might get a starting chance too.
But he was pretty good last year, and like Jeff said, like if you look at my pitchers in ABL, they're all, other than Tiedemann, they're all like 22 and older, because especially with the pitchers, I don't chase any younger guys for the most part. So Brown's definitely a guy that I like. But anyway, so I ended up with the 11th pick, and because I just didn't really have a lot of high picks this year, I didn't do a whole lot of research. I knew that if I could get in the teens, I would have a good chance at Dalton Rushing, who like has kind of had a lot of helium.
Yeah, I just pulled up the draft results too, and we can talk. I'll put your team on the screen actually, because and just highlight where you were in the draft. So you picked here's 11th. You ended up with Gavin Cross.
Yeah.
And Rushing went right. You ended up passing on Rushing. I'm interested in hearing about that.
Yeah.
And I know you were.
So basically, I wanted to be in the teens to have a chance at either DeLauder or Rushing. That was kind of because I had heard good things about both. Obviously, DeLauder was kind of getting a bunch of helium around that time, and this was before the news about his broken foot. But so that's kind of what I was looking for. And then I kind of started hearing about Spencer Jones. So I was looking into him. I was like, I'm going to have to make a choice between DeLauder and Jones here at 11.
And then you don't. Sam jumped in and took both of them.
Yeah, they both got picked right before. I think Sam and then Brendan picked them right before I was up.
Yeah.
So then I was like, shit, like Parada's still available. He's like maybe the best college hitter in this class, but he's a catcher. Rushing's a catcher. But then there's this Gavin Cross guy who I knew nothing about. I just knew that Baseball America has him as the number 1 prospect in Kansas City's shitty system.
They do.
But he had a nice debut. He put up some good numbers. Like the scouts seem to generally like him. Kansas City does have a shitty system, but that's because they've graduated so many guys the last year, and they've done a good job with their hit. I can't say much about their pitching development, but their hitting development's been pretty good. So, so I was like, okay, I'll take the non-catcher. That's why I decided to go with Cross.
So why did you take the non-catcher? Why don't you flesh that out a little bit, Duke? We alluded to it earlier in the podcast, and I'm just interested to hear, why you passed on Rushing. I have some thoughts on Rushing too, but why don't you tell me your view?
I think honestly, because Parada had slipped so far, I would have taken Parada over Rushing. Simply because like Rushing was amazing in his whatever he got, 100 at bats or whatever he had. But that's such a small sample size. Like that's kind of where I do lean on the scouting reports and like Baseball America and all the scouts like Parada more than rushing.
Yep. One of the things interesting. I'm sorry, you weren't finished.
No, I was just going to say, so I think I would have taken Parada over rushing if I went with the catcher, but generally speaking, I find it pretty tough to stomach rostering a catcher, especially drafting one that early in an FYPD.
Yeah.
So you're just not getting the volume that you're getting from, Gavin Cross, who's going to be getting like, assuming he's healthy, he's going to get like 650 plate appearances a year.
Right. And I think, you highlighted something about the risk inherent in catchers too, that it takes a long time for them to develop. They have to learn the defense, which is a real chore. And the Baseball America scouting report, rushing was actually one of my fades. Kind of jumping ahead a little bit in terms of our agenda, but he was one of my fades coming into the draft. I like him, but Baseball America really dinged him on his ability to handle fastballs. Raised the red flag there, and that's a concern for me. When you read that at that level that he's at, the low level of the minors, struggling with fastballs, which is an important thing to be able to do at the major league level, is hit fastballs.
Yeah, I would agree with you with fading him. He was getting way overdrafted, in my opinion, in FYPDs.
Yeah, I still like him. I had him ranked at the top of the second round, but I wasn't going to be touching him in the first round.
I agree. Yeah, like if I had the 20th pick and rushing was there, I'd be all over him. But at 11, I just couldn't really stomach doing that.
Well, I think you did all right with Gavin Cross. I mean, I think he's a solid pick there at 11. Jeff, let's talk about your approach going into the draft, because you only had three picks, right? And let's just pull your results up, because I think you got three nice players in the draft. But you what's that?
I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I originally had the 8th pick, I believe, coming out of the lottery.
Yep.
And I traded that to Sam for Christian Walker. I couldn't pass that up. But I was sad too, because there were players that I really liked there. And the player that I really would have wanted there was Brooks Lee, who went right before my pick.
Yep.
Who I really have fallen for this offseason. And if I still had that 8th pick, I would have taken a Parada for sure myself, with who was left. But
I mean, you got a future Hall of Famer, so you can't be too upset with your draft.
Who's that? Salas?
Yeah, Ethan Salas. He's already being dubbed a Hall of Famer.
There you go. He's an interesting catching prospect. Yet another catching prospect that was in this draft.
I was so my thought going into the draft with my first pick being at 2.4, I think it was we have a special opportunity here to see last year's J15 class, right? Last year's kind of the Dominican. We got to see who was awesome in the Dominican League, like kind of a sneak peek, and it's like it felt like a cheat code in a way, like to be able to see those guys. So I was really kind of locked in on Susana or Gutierrez, who were two guys that just like dominated the Dominican League and had a ton of hype, and two guys who were still growing too, still like developing, and both had the chance to be superstars, and in my mind, and Susana ended up going right before me, and I would have taken Susana ahead of Gutierrez in round 2. He went the pick before me to Detroit, and I think John said that he had Gutierrez right after Susana as well. So
yeah, well, at that point in the draft, Gutierrez was like the next guy on my queue, because after Susana, I had Susana ahead of Gutierrez as well, but that was like that for me in the draft. I didn't have a pick near this point. What I thought was kind of interesting about Susana is the number of times he was picked up illegally last year by people in the ABL, and then somehow he got in the second round. I was stunned by that, but when he was like floating to you, I thought you were going to get him at your pick there, and that would be nice. But I think
we talked about him before, and you knew that I was a fan, and I traded for Gutierrez like a few months ago, and in the other league we're in as well. So
yeah. I was disappointed when I was doing my draft prep in that league to see that you already had him.
Right.
Yeah.
So I had both those guys, Susana and Gutierrez, as kind of mid first round for me, just in my own evaluation. I would have taken them ahead of pretty much everyone after about pick 15 or so, personally.
Mhm. Yep.
Like, I don't know how you could take DePaula ahead of him. As exciting as DePaula is, you haven't seen it yet, right? He's brand new there. So,
Well, DePaula has a year. We've seen him. I mean,
yeah, that's true. You're right.
There are other players who haven't, but he has.
Right.
I mean, DePaula put up amazing numbers.
He did. I'm getting him mixed up, but
he's in the Dodger system, right? But Gutierrez is also extremely impressive and had a great debut. My approach was like I ended up in a very different position than you guys. I had 12 picks.
I do want to hear about why you love Lesko so much, because I think that most people would see that pick and think that you traded a lot to get him too, I believe. So.
Oh yeah, sure. So I'm happy to talk about that. I ended up with 2 first-round picks going into the draft. I had 1, which is the number 2 pick overall, and I took Elijah Green. And as Jeff knows, Elijah Green was number 1 on my board since July, and it didn't change. So it was kind of like draft day. It was Elijah Green no matter what. There are very few prospects in baseball who have received a 70 power and a 70 speed rating from Baseball America. Guys built like Bo Jackson. And he's very exciting. And he's only 18 years old. And the athleticism is through the roof on this kid. And I think his draft stock, in terms of fantasy draft stock, has kind of taken a fall by a small sample size of 52 plate appearances, where he struck out a lot, but also slugged. He had a 936 OPS to go with it. I felt very fortunate to get him at 2. There's certainly some hit tool risk there. And I know, Duke, you and I talked about right after the draft pick, why I took him over, either, Holiday or some of the other guys who were available there. Obviously very high pick. And, that may prove to be the wrong decision. I think there are, really, it's an unusual class that there are some really top prep players in this draft that have really high ceilings. We all know who they are. But Green was always the guy that I like the most out of that group, and which is not a knock on the other guys. I think they're excellent. And they probably have lower floors than Elijah Green. But I just thought he had the highest ceiling. So that was a calculus, in terms of that pick. I
wanted to ask you.
Year for Elijah, and he's got to to prove it. It's also a big year for Drew Jones because he got hurt, and he's got to show that he can live up the hype too, and that he's healthy. Answer to your question, Jeff, on Lesko, he's an interesting guy. He's obviously recovering from surgery. Baseball America gave him a 65 grade.
No, you're muted, Steve. There you go.
There you go. Sorry, I lost connectivity for a second, so it muted me. It's probably the way of the internet telling me I've talked too much. No, Lesko he got a 65 grade from Baseball America, and he was one of only 4 prospects in this draft class to get that grade. And the scouting report on Lesko described him as a delivery that was poetry in motion. And if you read the reports on him, they're just gushing. In terms of his command and the movement and shape of his pitches and the RPMs, the spin rates on them. I think he's a very exciting prospect. So I had him 5th on my board, right? And when I saw him fall to the middle of the first round, my decision making was, well, I can move up to get a top 5 guy on my board this year. And I traded away a couple 1s, I think, in subsequent years to move up to that position. And my thinking was that it was really one of proximity. I can take a top 5 guy now, right, and start having him develop in 2023, or I can wait to 2024 and take a pick that might be outside the top 20, might be in the low 30s, or low 20s, right? Because I don't know where my draft pick's going to be. And so I jumped at the chance, and I just think he has a lot of upside. Certainly, again, a lot of risk, but it highlights the fact that I'm willing to gamble on these guys that have the strong scouting reports, and that may, end up coming back to bite me. He's one of the few pitching prospects I would have traded up for, but it was largely driven by the Baseball America scouting report. I'd say the other
Did you
yeah, go ahead.
did you have any conversations with the White Sox or the Tigers about trading down at the top of the draft?
I thought about that.
Because I think I mean, assuming one of those guys wasn't in love with Green, I think the consensus was Green was the fourth best player in this draft. Like, I haven't seen too many lists where he was above 4. So I don't think I've seen any.
Yeah, Sam, by the way, said he would have taken Lesko at 20. So I'm glad I moved up to get him. Yeah, look, I thought about that trading down, and that may have been kind of a smart move from a gaming position in terms of just accumulating more picks. At the end of the day, there were a couple factors that made it more difficult. Harry obviously is in a different time zone, which made it difficult to work out a trade in time to make it work. We had a few talks earlier in the draft, but it wasn't clear to me who he was taking, and I did not want to lose out on taking Green. So I would have been guessing a little bit. Keeping in mind that, rightly or wrongly, Green was 1 on my board, right? And I didn't want to get cute and trade down to 3 and then end up with a guy that I liked but didn't love as much as Green. So at the end of the day, I just decided to stand pat. If Harry had been up and in our time zone, I might have had a conversation with him at that point.
Yeah.
Because I think I could have gone down to 3 and still got Green and picked up some extra picks. But the fact that he was, I think, in Australia at the time or somewhere other than New Zealand where he normally is, wherever he was not in our time zone. It was a big time difference. He was asleep and on autopilot. But just finishing the thought on the draft at the end, I had like several 4th and 5th round picks, and I just went to town on the J15s in those rounds. And to me, that's exactly kind of the sweet spot for them, where I was able to pick up a whole bunch of them, including 2 guys I really like. Ruben Santana is one of them, who was one of Baseball America's breakout prospects in the Rangers system, and he got a 60 power, 60 speed grade from them. And he did fairly well in the DSL last year, albeit in a small sample size. But I think he's a really exciting prospect, and he's in the 5th round. That was kind of a no-brainer for me. And then Justin Lawrence was a guy I picked up in the 4th round from the A's. Not Justin Lawrence, Lawrence Butler from the A's, who then proceeded to have a really hot spring, got a lot of notoriety. So he's a guy who's probably going to rise up lists, this preseason. But to pay that acquisition cost, is really worth it to me. And, I really trusted the process and the scouting to do that. That's why I accumulated those late picks and figured I could get guys that were better than, the college batters who were like 45 grades overall, who were left at that level in the 4th and 5th round. But that was the theory of replenishing my minor league system, because I only had 8 guys going into the draft. So, I needed a lot of picks.
I was going to note that to me, the draft season begins at the end of the regular season. Like in a league like ABL, like everyone's kind of looking for draft picks and excited about the draft picks, like you were, Steve. But
yeah,
as an alternative, I can kind of take advantage of that. And I was looking at my minors and trying to figure out how many minor leaguers I actually traded for after the end of the last ABL season. And there's like 7 or 8 of my 20. So I made trades with Cal, with Sam, with Alan, and with Duke, and with Jake, Diamondbacks Jake, and got a lot of guys I liked, making those trades, and really kind of changed the shape and the look of my minor league. So to me, like, I factor the acquisition of all those players into my draft haul when I think about it.
Yep. No, that's fair. And that's a fair way to look at it too, in terms of analytics, but, game roster construction theory, basis.
I just counted mine. I've 11 of my minor league players I've traded for since October.
Yep. I think
that's why I was okay having 1 pick, because my system is pretty well stocked. I was actually over 20 players going into the draft, and basically anything that wasn't a high 1st round pick was traded away, because I traded later 1st and 2nd round picks for guys like Canario and Alexander Ramirez, and like Zul Welta, or however you say his name, and Owen White and guys like that. So it was kind of like these guys are already fairly close to the majors, or at least have some at bats and some innings under their belt. So I'll take that rather than the lottery ticket.
Yep. No, I hear you. And I think, that was one of the interesting differences that we had in the approach, because I basically gutted my system prior to the draft to acquire major league talent. And then with the theory that I could, because the draft was so deep this year with the 2 J2 classes and a really strong first year player class, that I could just make up the players with the number of picks I was acquiring at the same time. So I think, you could kind of like peel the onion either way and kind of get to the same place. But there's certainly a lot of acquisition to trade away your excess major league talent that you can take advantage of between October and the draft time period, putting aside that freeze we have in place and making trades, which drives everybody crazy. But yeah, I think that also starting the process in July for me, when I start my draft process with Baseball America's first year player draft rankings when they first come out, really kind of like emboldened me to take that strategy, because I felt there was just so much depth in the class. And I felt good a lot about a lot of the guys in the class to do that. So last topic of the evening, I know we've gone a little bit longer than I anticipated. Just wondering if you had any kind of, crushes or fades going into the draft, or whether there's certain guys, I'll open it up to on your roster that you really have fallen in love with, or you're really, excited about. So Jeff, why don't we start with you?
Well, I wasn't necessarily focusing on my own roster because I'm in a lot of different dynasty leagues. But for my crushes right now, I think we talked about Gabriel Gonzalez earlier. I just expect him to ascend from everything I've read. I like his approach. I think I love Seattle's system, the way they develop players. I know, Kalenic aside, but I mean, I think it's he's gotten in his own head. He should be a star. The only thing in the way is himself. But so many players have ascended through that system in recent years, and I expect, especially the bats. Mason Wynn would be my other crush right now for the Cardinals, because I've been watching him all spring, and obviously Jordan Walker's getting the headlines.
As you should.
Yeah, he should. He's going to break camp with the Cardinals, and he's going to be amazing. And yeah, us Cardinal fans have been gushing over Walker for years now. This isn't news to us, but I think Wynn is right behind him, and I think he's going to be the next Ozzie Smith in St. Louis. I really do. That's
high praise.
It is. Wynn has that it factor. You can tell he loves the game. He's got a magnetic personality, and he's incredible on defense, and just going to be a force for the Cardinals for years and years. And I think he's underrated on Prospect List personally. I think he's underrated on your rankings too, Steve.
No, that's blame Baseball America, man, and Baseball HQ. Yeah, I mean, I think you'll see him, come up, and he'll naturally percolate up in the rankings for me too on the handbook because of his proximity as it gets stronger, and he's another guy who's ahead of his years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. He's definitely very cool, and I have a Jordan Walker signed baseball behind me that I got for $50.
Wow. Yeah, that'd be a lot more now.
It's worth more than 50 now, baby.
Yeah.
What about you, Duke? Crushes, fades, prospects you've fallen in love with?
So fades, there's a couple that I think have a high chance of pulling a Joe Adele. One's Oscar Colas. Right. I've talked about this a couple times in the chat. Like, he's having a great spring. I think he has 1 strikeout and 30 at bats or something like that, but he has 1 walk as well.
Yep.
So I think he's really setting up a lot of, especially like, I think for Dynasty, it's fine. Like, invest in him if you think he's going to be good in the future. But I think if you're drafting him for redraft, I think you're going to be disappointed.
Yep.
Because 1, he may not make the team, and 2, I think he kind of sucks. So that's definitely one fade who's got a lot of hype right now. Another is, this is probably controversial and a hot take, but Jackson Churio.
Interesting. Interesting. All right, tell me about that.
So I actually own him in Flug. I was on him pretty early. But
great offer incoming.
Yeah. I've actually thought about putting him on the block. But I just think he got so much hype and helium last year, and he kind of struggled as he was. And granted, he was still very, very young for each level, but he definitely struggled a bit as he was getting promoted. So do I think he's going to be a good baseball player? Yes. Do I think he is going to be, a perennial all-star and future Hall of Famer? I don't know about that.
Right.
So,
Interesting.
um,
Maybe at the apex of his value from a
what's
dynasty.
that?
He may be at the apex of his value from a dynasty perspective.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think. Like I think he was the number one prospect on a couple lists, and I just don't think he's that. I don't think he's there. And same with Ellie De La Cruz. Yes, it's very sexy, the home runs and the steals, but the hit tool, I don't know if it's going to be good enough.
Yep.
So I actually traded him in ABL 4.
Yep. I traded De La Cruz for similar reasons in other leagues as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting. The two players you identified, both of them are really hot prospects and great athletes. They've both been aggressively pushed by their organizations.
Right.
And I think you've seen the struggles given their youth relative to the level they're at. And some players aren't ready for that. It'll be interesting to see how they adjust this year. Whereas other players actually, succeed like Jordan Walker did. And that is very telling. And to some extent, Andrew Painter and Yuri Perez as well. Although each of them, had adjustment periods too when they got promoted.
You do have to be a little tempered in taking victory laps before these guys have seen the majors, though, right? I mean,
yeah, 100%. They got to do it in the show, and it's like the Bull Durham speech that Crash Davies gives to Nuke LaLoosh. They're going to light you up like a pinball machine, right? And stay, stay cocky and arrogant. But yeah,
Max Scherzer's going to find out what Jordan Walker's holes are, and
sure,
it's going to happen. So.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, you already saw Senga strike him out and make him look like a fool. That's going to happen.
Well, I was teasing Jeff because maybe a month ago, because he likes to rip on O'Neal Cruz's strikeout rate against lefties last year. Yeah. But guess who had a better swinging strike rate in the majors last year than Jordan Walker had in AA? That would be one O'Neal Cruz. So
one player's getting better, getting worse, though.
Well, I guess we'll see. We'll see where they end up.
Well, in ABL, I love the kid. And I wish him the very best.
Yeah. No, I think Cruz is going to be fine. I think the split thing is way overstated. He never had any issues in the minor leagues against lefties, and I think he's going to be fine.
You bring up an interesting point about prospects, both of you guys, in terms of when they hit the majors and the struggles and what you do with them in terms of your evaluation. And I think that's where you really have to be patient. Because, Cruz is a good example. I mean, he did struggle mightily against lefties last year, but it's his first cut at the majors. It's not surprising to see him struggle against lefties. The left-handed pitchers going against left-handed hitters, they're very sophisticated, very hard to hit major league pitching, period. And you did see glimpses of the elite athleticism the kid has. And the power is very real. And so I think it's very important for a guy like that, not to sell low on him. He's a guy I'm buying if people are like,
for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And
not cheap this year, though.
No. In fact, I think, there's no discount on him. Right. I saw him go for $18 in.
I've seen him go ahead of Swanson and Bogarts on a regular basis. Yeah.
People tend to fall in love with these.
In Roto, he's going to steal way more bases than those guys, even if he does suck against lefties.
Yeah, no, I think, look, what you have to be worried about in redraft for him is whether there's any platoon. I don't think Pittsburgh's going to ultimately platoon him. I think they're just going to give him help. And I'm definitely buying. But, with Jordan Walker, if he comes up and struggles, I'm in. I love the kid's makeup, and he's got tremendous raw power as well. I think it's going to be really exciting in the real life NL Central to see those two guys hitting home runs for the next 15 years potentially.
The Cruz will be on the Yankees within the next 4 or 5 years. But I get the point.
I'm sorry about that. Walker will probably end his career with the Cardinals. So
probably.
Yeah. Sorry about that for you as a Pirates fan.
So I gotta go. I gotta hit my crutch up because I need to take a dig at Jeff. So Sammy Zavala is my big crush this year. I think I have him in every dynasty league. I've overpaid for him. And
Yeah.
it's complete shot in the dark. But he went up to A-ball last year as a 17-year-old and killed it. So, like really good exit velocities, good approach. Like his strikeout rate was high, but if you look at his swinging strike rate, it was. Well, I can tell you what it is. I haven't pulled up right now.
And meanwhile, Alan had a pizza bet comment. I'm wondering what the pizza bet is on. No.
I would pizza bet that Zavala is a better player than who's the guy you like? Gabby Gonzalez. I would, because I've had this conversation with Jeff a little bit because Zavala is 6 months younger than Gonzalez and arguably better at A-ball last year.
All right, I sense a pizza bet coming up on this right now.
We just have to figure out the terms. I'm not sure how to do it.
Yeah, for the uninitiated, that is, betting with the cost of a pizza over a subject matter for the uninitiated. I want a piece of that.
No, I don't.
Velocity.
I can't make a hard argument as to like why Gonzalez is going to be better than Zavala. Is Sam Aaron's brother? Are they just happen to have the same last name? Or
I don't think so. I think Sammy is an international guy, and Aaron I think played college ball.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah. I mean, he might be. I actually saw your love for Zavala like given to me to trade for him in one league too. So sometimes when you see a good player really in on a guy, it kind of
it goes to the point I was making earlier, right? I mean, look, you see Duke picking him up and falling in love with him. You're like, oh, maybe there's something there. You know?
Yeah. Jeff's loved a lot of guys that I'm like, oh, I need to take a closer look here. And now a couple years ago, you were telling me how great Hoskins was, and I was like, he kind of sucks. And then I ended up having Hoskins on all of my teams that year.
Right.
Yep.
I was going to say my fade real quick. I didn't get into. It's actually Spencer Jones on the Yankees, and I know he was getting a lot of hype, but I really kind of think that was the Yankees hype machine at full force. Like I think actually got to see this kid live, and he struck out looking just awful every time he was up, like he'd never seen a breaking ball in his life. And he's huge, yes, but folks need to understand if they're drafting him, this kid's 4 or 5 years away. He's not even remotely close. And it wasn't just those couple of bats I watched. I kind of dug deeper and looked into some of his stats and watched some more of his at bats throughout the minor league season, and he's struggling mightily up there. And
he's got some holes in that swing. Those big levers, those long levers.
He does. He hasn't figured it out like Walker and O'Neill and Cruz and some of the other big guys have. So,
well, I mean, it took Judge a little longer than normal. I've heard that the taller guys. I've heard that for a couple of the taller players, it takes a little bit longer.
Yep, that's fair. And look, I think Spencer Jones is one of those guys who may struggle when he gets to a little bit higher level, and maybe that's the time to pounce to get him.
Yeah.
Because he may go lower. His market value may drop, which is kind of interesting. Well, listen, guys, I really enjoyed the discussion. I know I kept you a little bit longer than we anticipated, but I think it was interesting and lively, and I really appreciate you joining the podcast. Hope you guys will, get on board later in the year. We'll have maybe a recap about how our prospects have done in, their first full season in the minors, and see if I was right on Elijah Green or wrong. And Duke, you can hold me to the fire on that. But thanks so much. Loved having you on the show, and hope the people watching it enjoyed it as well. And want to keep people to remember to ABP, always be prospecting. All right, I'll see you guys later. Thanks everybody. Have a good night.
Steven.